Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 20. We begin with a review of the Greek tenses and the future tense from our last lesson. As I hope you recall, there are 5 major tenses in Koine Greek: the present, the imperfect, the future, the aorist, and the perfect. Tenses in Greek carry more of the connotation of aspect, type of action, than time. So far in this course, we've looked at the present and the future tenses. There are 7 different patterns of tense and voice in combination that we will look at in this course: the present, the imperfect, the future active, the aorist active, the perfect passive, and the aorist passive. Of those combinations, there are 6 basic principal parts for the Greek verb that are used to make these combinations: the present, the future active, the aorist active, the perfect middle passive, most likely really the perfect middle, and then the aorist passive. As we go along in the course, we'll explicate these more further. But right now, you have some acquaintance with the present and future active principal parts. The future tense in Greek has the same meaning as it does in English. In the future active, that tense is formed by putting 4 pieces together: the future active stem, a tense formative, sigma, a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, and then the primary active meanings. If one is forming the future middle, the only difference is the use of the primary middle passive endings. These are the personal endings, as you've learned them so far, the primary half of them. The actives, nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, and nsi, and the middle passives, mai, sai, tai, methas, thet, and ntai. In this lesson, lesson 20, we're going to look at the relationship between verbal roots and tense stems. We'll review the pattern 1, formation of the future, where the root is not modified. But then we'll look at how the future is formed when different roots are involved, when the future's stems end in a liquid consonant, or what other kind of regular modifications there are. We're looking, as always, for patterns. It's easier to recognize patterns than individual forms, but if those patterns are committed to memory, parsing can follow more easily. First of all, the difference between a root and a stem. The root is the most basic form of a verb. It will be indicated by Mounce in his textbook by a shortened form of the verb with an asterisk in front of it. The root is its most basic form. A stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. So whereas there may be one root for the verb as a whole, there will be different stems. The stem is the basic form in a particular tense. So, for example, Leo, the present stem, is li. Blepso, the future stem, is bleps. In many of the verbs we've learned so far, the tense stem is formed from the root being the most basic form, and slight modifications being made to create present stem, future stem, or aorist stem. So, for example, with the root bal, which means to throw, one can easily see the presence of bal in the present stem, balo, the future stem, balo, and the aorist stem, ebalon. The root is the most basic form from which each of the individual stems come. However, there are also cases where a verb may have more than one root forming the present stem and another root forming other stems. For example, the very common word erkomai, I come or go, has at least two roots. Erk is the root behind the stem erk of the present erkomai. But a different root, eliuth, is behind the future stem eliusamai. Remember a sigma and a dental. The dental drops out. But it's also behind the aorist stem. If you look carefully, you'll see the lambda and the theta present. The initial epsilon has lengthened to an eta, and the intermediate diphthong u has ablauded out, but it is the same root. So one root forms the present, another root forms the future and the aorist in this particular example. As we move from root to stem, one of the realities is that quite often it's the present stem where more modification takes place than moving from root to one of the other stems. For example, balo, the root comes unchanged into the future and aorist. But in the present, that root, bal, is modified by an additional lambda to form the present. So it's not that a lambda has dropped out, moving from present to future. It's that to the root, bal, an extra lambda has been added to form the present. What do we take away from that first section on roots and stems? Remember this. The root is the most basic form of the verb. The stem is the most basic form in a particular tense. Many, many words have one root forming all the stems. But in some verbs, more than one root is active. And those, frankly, are the complicated ones. There aren't many of them, but a couple of them occur quite frequently in the New Testament. All right, let's turn our attention now to the various ways in which the future is formed off of these roots and stems. We've already learned the first pattern, where the root is not modified. Let's review the three examples of pattern 1. Our paradigm verb, leo, is such a pattern 1 standard, where 4 elements go together: the stem, the tense formative, the connecting vowel, and the personal ending, forming our futures. Liso, lises, lise, lisamen, lisite, lisusi. Very simple. We know that one quite well. A slight modification of pattern 1 occurs with contract verbs, where the verbal stem ends in a short vowel, alpha, epsilon, or omicron. In each case, the stem vowel lengthens when it's followed by a sigma and connecting vowel and personal ending. Agapeso is the future of agapao. And when the stem ends in a stop, the addition of a sigma will cause the appearance of either a psi, a xi, or just a sigma if the stem is a dental. But all three of these examples are following pattern 1, where the root is the same, a tense formative is added, along with connecting vowel and personal ending to form the future. Let's now look at the most complicated ones, those where a verb has different roots that lead to particular stems. 3 very common words in the New Testament do that. The word for coming and going, erkomai, the word for speaking, lego, and the word for seeing, horao. Notice in the examples given here, there is a different root behind the future stem and the future forms. So, erkomai, its future is eliusomai because the future uses a different root, eliuth. Ero is the future of lego because that particular verb uses a different root to form the future. Opsomai is the future of horao because, again, the verb horao has more than one root. There's no clear pattern as to whether a verb will have one root or multiple roots behind its 6 stems. In the case of these examples, the best thing to do is simply memorize the forms, making a separate vocabulary card for erkomai and eliusomai, lego and ero, horao and opsomai, and simply memorize the forms. Liquid futures are an interesting case. When one first looks at them, they look quite confusing, but there are key patterns to be discovered, which in fact make them rather easy to identify. Liquids are stems that end in one of the liquid consonants, mu, nu, lambda, or rho. These consonants are identified as liquids because either the air is rerouted through the nose or the tongue is twirled as the air flows. They're liquid consonants. In the case of a stem ending in a liquid, the tense formative for the future is not sigma, but epsilon sigma. So the future active of a liquid verb is formed by combining the future active stem, the tense formative epsilon sigma, a connecting vowel, and a primary ending. But when that tense formative epsilon sigma is combined with the connecting vowel, as in our example here, epsilon sigma omicron, the sigma drops out and the remaining epsilon and omicron contract to the diphthong omicron upsilon. So the first person plural form, future active form of meno is menumen. It looks like an epsilon contract. It's not an epsilon contract, it's a liquid future. But because of the tense formative SO and the contracting that occurs, it looks like an epsilon contract. In this chart, you see the full paradigm of the future active indicative of meno, where the tense formative epsilon sigma is added. It combines with the connecting vowel to cause the sigma to drop out and a contraction to form. And the resulting forms do look very much like they are epsilon contracts of the present. But these are liquid futures. So meno is I shall remain. Menes, you singular, will remain, and so forth. Please note, I was reading from the 3rd column. In the 4th column, in the bright yellow, are the forms of meno in the present active indicative. Notice how the accent is different. Meno is the present. I remain. Meno is the future. I shall remain. Menes is the present. You singular will remain. Menes is the future. You singular will remain, and so forth. Without the accent marks, it would be possible to confuse the present and the future of some liquids. but with the accent marks, if the stem ends in a liquid and it looks like an epsilon contract, it's a liquid future. As a side note, liquids often add something to the root to form the present stem. We'll talk about this more in what's called pattern 4, but with the examples we've looked at so far, you might want to notice that the present is sometimes formed by doubling a consonant. So from the root apostel, the future, you can clearly see the root there with 1 lambda. In the present, there's 2 lambdas. Same with balo, 1 lambda in the future, 2 lambdas in the present. That's an example of the present form doubling the consonant. Another thing that often occurs with liquids, when the root moves to the present, the same root that's used to form the future, is the addition of a iota. So the root of iro is r. You can see it clearly behind the future indicative, aro, but the present adds a iota, iro. Apokteno, apokteno, notice the extra iota in the present. Egero, and egero, notice the extra iota again in the present. So moving from root to stem with many liquids, changes occur to form the present. The present is more irregular than the future. Pattern 4, roots modified regularly. We're looking for patterns, and I'm going to show you a number of these right now. It's not necessary to remember how to form them, but just to be alert to them so that you can recognize and parse forms. Here we go. Pattern 4 verbs are verbs where the root changes to form the present. We've had some examples before. We'll give you the full set now. There are 3 basic ways in which this occurs. It occurs one way if the roots end in a stop. It occurs a second way through the doubling of consonants. And it occurs the third way through the adding of other letters or some of those letters dropping out. Let's look at each of these in turn. First of all, if a root ends in a stop, and if that stop is a dental, then Greek will sometimes add izo or azo to the root to form the present stem. The word for baptism, the verb, the present form is baptizo, and the future form is baptizo. What's going on here is the root is baptid, ending in a delta, a dental. An izo is added to the end to form the present, baptizo, and when the future, sigma, is added to the dental, of course, the future drops out, according to the square of stops. So we have an explanation for the 2 forms, baptizo and baptizo. The present is formed because an izo was added to a dental. If the root ends in a velar, then sometimes aso, alpha, sigma, sigma, omega, is added. For example, tarak, to that velar, the key, aso is added. The present is taraso. But when just the sigma, omega of the future are added, the future form is taraxo because of the square of stops. So one pattern that you'll see is the addition of izo or azo to the present or aso to the present when the stems end in a stop. The doubling of consonants, we've already talked about that when we looked at some pattern 3 liquids, but let's just review here. Another way in which the present is formed from a root is by doubling a consonant, as in apostello and balo. A third way of forming the present from a root is to add letters or cause letters to drop out. We've seen examples of iotas being added to the root to form the present stem in airo, apokteno, and agero. Another combination that can be added to such forms is isko. So, for example, the root apothon in the present gets isko added to form the present stem apothnesko. The future, because apothon, that root, ends in a liquid, see the nu there, gets an epsilon sigma, and it also switches to deponent. So the future is apothonumai. Looks like an epsilon contract, but it's a future liquid middle deponent. Gano, the root for knowledge, is another example of where isko is added, and interestingly, an extra iota drops in between the gamma and the nu to form the present. So you get additions both of isko and the extra iota here. The future is formed quite regularly with a sigma and then the middle deponent personal endings. So we've noted a number of patterns as we move from root to stem. The key thing to remember from this lesson is that stems don't change to form other stems. Rather, it's roots that are modified to form stems. In some situations, it's quite simple. In some situations, there are different roots forming those stems. The liquids are the new case here, but there are other examples of regular patterns using iso, azo, aso, isko, and so forth. The last point in this lesson is actually quite easy because we do this in English all the time, and that's forming compounds. There are compound verbs in Greek. A compound verb consists of a preposition being added to a verb, and often that preposition intensifies or even slightly modifies the root meaning of the verb. So ek plus balo yields ekbalo, or to throw out. And the same combination occurs in forming the future, ekbalo. Just notice, because the root of this verb is bal, the future does not have the extra lambda that the present has. This lesson brings you to the end of the first semester of Biblical Greek. And it's a rather dense lesson because we're hunting patterns. But hunting patterns, identifying patterns, recognizing patterns. Oh, that isko there, that must be a present. Aso, that must be a present. Helps in the parsing process. Ultimately, what we're after in this course is being able to identify and read Greek. We're not trying to create Homeric authors, just people of faith who can read the Word of God and clearly explicate its meaning for those who can't read it in the originals. So, despite the complication, there's a wonderful opportunity at the other end, and we're halfway there.